Hey there, let's talk about China during the age of imperialism. We've been talking about how Europeans, the United States, basically stronger countries have instituted some level of dominance, usually for economic gain over other countries. Well, China had been largely self-sufficient for a very long time. And this goes back to, we talked about the treasure fleets, and we talked about how usually if a country is going to do trade with China, they were going to have to perform some kind of a humiliating ritual known as kowtow, right? Kowtow. And so, at the same time, China was mostly self-sufficient, but they didn't buy any goods from Europe. But Europeans, in particular in Britain, they depended upon Chinese goods. In particular, we all know the Brits gotta have their tea, and so they paid tons of money for tea. And really, China bought nothing from Britain. In fact, you remember in the earlier unit we talked about how King George the Third had sent a letter or had received an offensive letter from China and their emperor saying basically all the reasons why China is too good to need British goods, and they kind of held to that. So Macartney, who was the ambassador for Britain, wanted to get China to buy something they could produce in exchange for tea. It was just they wanted a favorable balance of trade, and they wanted to be able to exploit China for their tea, among other things. And so China, who considered themselves, as we discussed earlier, the Middle Kingdom, this is when they would send back the offensive letter. Now, China was also self-sufficient. They didn't need trade with Europe, but the British had already begun to grow poppies in India. All right, so here's the deal: is that poppies are what opium is grown from that. Today, you watch the news, you talk about, you hear the discussion about opioids. I hope I spelled that right. And this one here would be your big-time painkiller stuff like Percocet or whatever else it might be. And so today in our news, we hear about opioid addiction. We hear about people who are strung out on these things, incredibly addictive painkillers. Well, the Chinese have been using opium for centuries as some kind of a pain deterrent. And so the British, knowing how addictive it is, they began to grow poppies in India, and then they would sell these opioids, or the opium that they produced, to China. And over a couple of decades, the Chinese began to smoke it. That's what they would do, and they became incredibly heavily addicted on opium. And the British would import this, essentially like drug trade, import this into China and string out the Chinese on this drug. And obviously you can imagine that the Chinese didn't like it. They also would use the profits to buy tea from the Chinese and offset the unfavorable trade that they had with them. And so the Qing Emperor of China, the Qing dynasty was in power, sent a letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her, asking her to end opium sales in China. After having received no response, he did all he knew to do, and that is establish war with Britain. And this became the first Opium War of 1839, the first Opium War. The British completely dominated the Chinese. China did not stand a chance against the British in this case, and the British also won Hong Kong, which they only just released back to China in, I believe, the year 1999. And they also gained extraterritorial rights. So what these extraterritorial rights did was it meant that Chinese law didn't apply to the British in the same way at the different ports that they were allowed to do trade with the Chinese. And so this was something that the Chinese people absolutely hated. They resented the idea that these foreigners had influenced their country in such a way. And so China, on top of this issue with the British and the opium and all that kind of stuff, they had internal problems as well. There was famine. There was discontent. There was extreme poverty. So usually, and we talked about this, I don't know if we talked about this before, but there is this cycle. This dynastic cycle that would occur throughout Chinese history again and again and again, with the beginnings of one dynasty and then ultimately the end of that dynasty and the beginning of another. And usually a dynasty had begun to wane or had begun to lose favor of the people about the time that these things here start to happen. And so there was going to be a rebellion known as the Taiping Rebellion that was ultimately put down, but the result here is, one, about 20 million people, maybe even more than that, maybe even twice that, had perished during this rebellion. And there was actually, like, during the time, a government established temporarily in Taiping that was ultimately put down by British and French influence. But the fact of the matter is, this led to kind of a showcase of the Chinese weakness during this time period. China, after the fact, attempted some reforms, but ultimately could not rival Europe, and the Europeans continued to kind of inch their way into these spheres of influence, where the Europeans would control Chinese trade in certain regions. Now, the United States, they were kind of afraid that they would be left out of this whole operation, and they actually had already established and had been a good trading partner with the Chinese. We just talked in the earlier video about how they used Hawaii as a trading post, or as like a go-between between China and the United States. So they wanted to ensure that everyone would be able to get involved here in the trade, and so they instituted this idea of an open door policy with, here it is right here, an open door policy with Europeans. And what this essentially meant was that the Europeans were not going, or no one was really going to go in and establish a colony over China. They would keep these spheres of influence, and it would enable everyone to be able to go and basically dominate trade in China. So Emperor Guangzhou was the emperor at the time. He had succeeded this lady, the Dowager Empress, and he was more of a reformer. And so in 1898, he institutes reforms for education, the economy, and the military, and really was kind of threatening the traditional order of things in the minds of the conservative elite. And so many of these Qing conservatives, they freaked out, and they reinstated the Dowager Empress, which was Emperor Guangzhou's mom, all right, and she had her son arrested and undid all of these reforms. Now, these reforms were designed to kind of help fix China's issues and modernize them, some of the things they could do in order to kind of prevent the Europeans from having so much power over them. But the Chinese people, as a result of what the conservatives here in this case had done, they were furious. And so, in an effort to force the Dowager Empress to reform, and also in an effort to reduce the influence of foreigners and Christians, because they hated the idea that their people were adopting foreign religions, they established the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Now that sounds like a pretty cool little group name right there. But they became known as the Boxers, and there was this rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion. Now, here's the reality, is that the Boxer Rebellion was a complete fail, in that it did not do anything to overthrow the Empress, and it did not do anything to get rid of the foreigners. Alright, and I've got this written down here that it was a major fail, but here's what it did do. It absolutely fueled nationalistic feelings, and so the Chinese people start to kind of rally behind who they are as an identity, who they are in their struggle and in their history. And even the Dowager Empress recognized that there was a need for extreme change. And so the problem with this is, unfortunately, because at this point so much of the damage had been done, that no amount of reforms that she was able to institute was going to change anything in China before the Communist Revolution, which would also mark the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of China's, essentially their current government. So we will talk about that in a future video. And in the next time, we're going to continue on our discussion of imperialism and look at Japan. Thanks for watching.